Hello and welcome. You're watching Business Plus. I'm Shweta Kothari. In the studio is my colleague Rakesh Khar. We are, of course, tracking all the important stories this afternoon, but beginning the show with poverty, often considered to be an indicator of holistic growth and progress in a society. While India has often earned laurels for its growth story, poverty sticks out like a sore thumb, but no more. In what comes in as good news, a total of 415 million people moved out of poverty in India within just 15 years, from 2005 and 6 up until 2019 and 21. The latest update of the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI, which was released by United Nations Development Programme UNDP and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at the University of Oxford, augurs well for India. Now, 25 countries, including India, successfully halved their global MPI values within 15 years, showing rapid progress. This is a remarkable achievement specifically for India as the world's most populous nation. We want to discuss the core important development indicators and poverty in particular and what led to this revision. With me is Karan Bhasin, who's an economist, and Rakesh Khar continues to be here in the studio. I want to begin by asking you, Karan, this is an important indicator, as I mentioned at the start of the show, of how well a country is doing. And poverty has often been used as an indicator when we talk about growth and progress, using, of course, various parameters and reports that are out there. But this report from UNDP, in a sense, validates India's growth story. It validates the fact that India is doing the best it can, especially when we talk about alleviating people, poorest of poor people, and providing them with basic necessities.
So, if you look at any of the indicators that we have seen over the last couple of years, I mean, let's go back to 2019, which is immediately prior to, of course, the general elections in India. And even after that, there was a lot of talk about poverty having increased since 2011. And of course, it came with the backdrop of the 2017 survey not being released. And I just want to go back in time to that moment, because even at that point, it seemed counterintuitive to argue that poverty did not decline post 2011. And the reason I'm making this point today is that even after this report, I'm quite confident that there would be a substantial amount of people who would still hold on to their prayers that poverty did not decline since 2011. But that's the nature of this subject. It is a very polarizing issue. People have their own prayers and they don't want to change their prayer beliefs at all. But we can't argue with data, we can't argue with statistics. If you look at 2011 and compare it with say 2019 or even 2019-20, remember the multidimensional indicator that we have, the survey was actually conducted right in the middle of the pandemic. So some amount of states were surveyed in 2019-20, and then some states were surveyed in 2021. So despite that kind of income stress, despite that kind of pain that people were feeling at that point in time, what we now know is that poverty did not increase in India. And what we know from a separate strand of research, which is the unidimensional measures stuff, where I work with Dr. Surjit Bhalla and Arvind Virmani. It again shows a persistent trend decline in poverty since early 2000. So the limited point being that India has made tremendous progress over the last 20 odd years in eradicating extreme poverty, in eradicating or reducing, multidimensional poverty to a large extent. And India remains the only democratic country to have achieved this. And I think that is the silver lining, because people talk about China's success, which is remarkable in its own right. But remember, this is the only known example of a large democracy, with so much of diversity being able to deliver the kind of social mobility that typically more authoritarian form of governments have delivered in the last century.
Rakesh, you've often disliked the term welfare state and the welfare schemes that states have doled out, but in a sense, it is what many would say helps in social mobility, upliftment of people, especially when we talk about basic aspects such as education, housing, power, sanitation. All in all these numbers are really looking well, and also a vindication of the fact that we perhaps need more welfare policies if we can't provide them with jobs.
No, fair enough. I think, I am a fair critic, I guess, of, not targeted welfare economics. For instance, now look what's happening in Karnataka. We have the, the ration scheme, which unfortunately has again got caught into the political quagmire between the centre and the Karnataka government on who will release the Food Corporation of India quota. So the state government has now decided to replicate and replace it with cash. So, we don't know exactly where it comes and where it goes. In that sense, there is a challenge. But yes, undoubtedly, we must celebrate the upliftment of, say, 45 crore people, if we look at the data that you presented just now, and it's coming from an independent global body. So we have to celebrate it. In fact, the timing is quite politically right for the current establishment. We're just 9 months away from elections. So when you say, but the good point here again is the larger point which we must celebrate is not just that the timing. The bigger issue here is that the successive efforts of governments over a period of time from 2011 onwards, something that I have been repeatedly stressing. It's not one particular government. It is a continuation of efforts at that particular level, addressing poverty as the core challenge. Obviously, we need to do a little more. But a couple of fundamental challenges still remain. One is that, Karan, poverty debate, is so polarizing, as you rightly mentioned. We've been speaking to economists who favor a certain trajectory and have a particularly socialist point of view, who argue that the data that global bodies use is essentially data supplied by the government of India of the day and in the past, whenever his government has said the data. And that data is not being respected immensely inside as well. And there is a global hue and cry on, the data sanctity, which in turn leads to possibly doctored, results. I am personally all for this data, but, how do you respond? How does one respond to the charge that, all this data might not be reflecting truly on the ground? Karan?
So let me make 2 or 3 quick points here. This particular issue of multidimensional poverty, the underlying data is the DHS survey, which of course is funded, aided by independent agency in the US, and it's conducted in many developing countries, not just in India alone. And this is the National Family Health Survey, the NFHS data set that we have. So we had the survey in mid 2000s, and then we had another one in 2015, and then of course this one happened. And of course, some people might find this data to be inconvenient, but the fact remains that, when you look at the multidimensional indicators, there's sanitation, electricity, etc. And we do have hard statistics that sanitation indeed improved post 2015 and, between 2015 and 2019. Same with even electrification efforts, because those were, major thrust areas, access to cooking fuel, etc. So much so that someone who would not be characterized as being kind to Mr. Modi, John Dress, himself in an Indian Express article reluctantly mentions in a table, he doesn't mention in the article, but he presents it in a table, that the poverty decline was much faster between 2015 and 19 than before. So clearly, it's as far as data is concerned, this data is widely used, and since it's aided by a external agency which hosts this unit level data. So if I want to access the NFHS surveys, I can't do it on an Indian government's website. I have to actually go on the DHS website to get it. So that's point number one. And the second point is, since you mentioned that a lot of socialist kind of academics don't want to believe that this data is credible, etc. But what they do believe is in the periodic labor force survey that comes out. I mean, they of course believe more in CMI than PLFS. But if you look at the PLFS, there's one question that PLFS has on consumption, which many, including some people of the EAC to PM, have also used to arrive at all sorts of poverty estimates, unidimensional poverty estimates. But where they're conspicuously silent, and I'm using this word responsibly, conspicuously silent is to use the same statistic that they find acceptable to generate poverty estimates for generating inequality estimates. And why I say they're conspicuously silent is because that particular statistic shows a consistent decline in consumption inequality in India from 2017 till 2020 to 2023, even 2021, 22. So it's a very consistent decline that we see using this measure. But when you open the newspaper, when you talk to academics, when you talk to anyone who's an economic commentator, they would say that inequality has in fact increased.
Yeah, so
whereas you have hard.
Yeah, Yeah, Karan, the
Yeah,
problem is that, the inequality debate also draws us to the larger issue of rich getting richer, poor getting poorer. Because there is some small sample data on that, number of billionaires rising in India, so we shouldn't have a quarrel ideologically with that. I was coming to the larger point, Karan, broadly, we must celebrate, as I said again and repeating it, that there is a great push for alleviating poverty at the state government level and at the central government level. So there is large consensus politically on achieving that. But there are two very clear-cut models that are emanating now. One is the entitlement model, the other one is the empowerment model. So what I'm drawing you to. The entitlement model is generally symbolized by the UPA or the advisory council that the UPA government ran, Jain raises of the world, and then the empowerment model is more about Jan Dhan and targeted models. So I really don't know what the verdict is on, which one is the best, or do we need a blend of both? So what is your take as we move into the election year, and poverty alleviation will obviously be a big election pitch? Which is the two, which of these two models should India see through as the best potential tool to really make India draw its full dividend when it comes to its citizen population?
Many people might disagree, but growth is the best tool used by India to alleviate people out of poverty. There's nothing else which delivers poverty alleviation as well as growth does, and we see it in Indian evidence. We see it in Indian experience. Even when we are talking about welfareism done by the state, which are targeted, a lot of that welfare is possible, feasible, only because of growth, which creates those additional revenues. So at a national level, I think the verdict is very clear. We saw a faster decline when we moved away from an entitlement-based regime to an empowerment-based one, which is why poverty alleviation was much faster post 2013-14 rather than prior to it. As far as different states are concerned, I suspect that many states are making different political choices and policy choices. Some states want to pivot more towards an empowerment-based system, and some want to continue with welfare pitch. The problem, of course, is that if a state, say like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, want to be a more welfare state, and they're able to generate investment, they're able to generate growth, they will be able to afford it. So it's a question of whether you can afford it or not. But if a state like Punjab wants to do it, it obviously does not have the resources to be able to build an welfare state. So that's the choice that politicians must make, and they have to make that choice responsibly.
Absolutely.
I don't know if they're making that choice responsibly at the moment, and that's why I have my reservations. You can create a welfare state, but if you're not able to afford it, eventually any gains that you might make in terms of alleviating poverty would be only temporary, and the economic hardship that will follow would be very similar to what we see in the region, whether we look at Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and even Bangladesh, which seems to be struggling at the moment.
Right.
So we must be conscious of the model that we want to pursue.
Tough pitch, whether to be a welfare state, whether to empower.
Karan,
An interesting point breaker. Karan, appreciate you taking time out and joining us this afternoon. We're going to shift focus now. The 50th GST Council meeting is underway. The meeting will deliberate on a host of issues, including claims on input tax credit, taxation of online gaming. Among other things, Council is also likely to clarify on GST rates applicable on food and beverages sold in multiplexes. It will also finalize contours for setting up appellate tribunal and the demand of the industry to reimburse full CGST and 50% of IGST in the 11 Hill states under the scheme for budgetary support. We are, of course, discussing the meeting, the big GST meeting, 50th GST meeting that is currently underway. Joining us at this point in time is Syed Peeran, who is the partner at Lakshmikumaran, and Srinath Srinath is also with us, who is an independent markets commentator. Gentlemen, appreciate you both taking time out. I want to begin by asking you, Srinath, we are, of course, discussing what is likely to come out. Quickly run us through what the big expectations will be from this meeting.
So I think the big expectation obviously is the bringing GST under PMLA. I think it's a politically sensitive conversation. While there have been clarification given that it is only about information sharing, how will it pan out with investigative powers? That's going to be a big one. Two, I think we're also going to see potential conversation around reconstitution of the ministerial panel that has to decide on the rates, the GST rates. That's two. The third, which is the contiguous one, is going to be some of the states have been arguing for continued compensation to be given to them considering that they've been getting lower than promised revenues. So how is it going to pan out? We will know soon. The industry, I think, is also going to watch out what's going to happen to the entire concept of GST rates on online gaming. I think this has been in the conversation quite for some time. While the group of ministers have given an indication that 28% GST would be a good rate, I mean, I think the jury is still out, especially being a politically sensitive conversation about gaming. I think, I don't know, for all the flawed conversations around morality, I don't know, this could play out very, very differently. I think these are the critical ones.
Okay. On gaming specifically, Syed, we are given to understand that the government is, of course, trying to bring online gaming into GST. It's going to be a regulatory hurdle for the government, not just something that they are going to internally disagree or agree upon. It's also going to be about trying to get all these players to agree, the stakeholders to agree. Tough ask.
Yeah, definitely, it's a tough ask. But I think the gaming industry has been looking at this from some time now. There have been certain litigations also on that front, whether the activity of online gaming itself would be subject to GST itself or not. Of course, now they are trying to bring some clarity by way of specific amendments, I suppose, in the act by which they will seek to clarify that online gaming with or without stakes should be subject to GST. I think the two issues which will be surrounding this aspect would be the increase of rate of tax, or rather, right now, I think the gaming industry is paying taxes on 18% on the platform fee which they are earning. So the conversation will be around whether the rate of tax should be 28% on the gaming, online gaming, and on what value, whether it should be on 28% on the platform fee or the gross gaming revenue, that's a GGR, whether it should be only on that or should be restricted to that, or should be on the entire face value, or as in the entire stakes. So whatever is the contribution made to the prize pool, whether it should be on that value. So these are the two conversations which are going to be happening, whether the tax rate should be maximum 28% in line with gambling, or whether it should be restricted to 18%. I think there should be some consensus there, where there may be some sort of a consensus to bring it under 28%, but more interesting conversation would be on what value they should charge GST. I think the sector would be more keen to see which direction the government goes, and I think they would be happy if that is restricted to GGR rather than moving on to the entire stakes which are being collected from the players.
An important, interesting point would also be to differentiate between, games of skill versus games of chance, and that is, of course, where more clarity is also needed. Rakesh, very interesting point to begin with. GST under PMLA. What does it mean for people who are trying to evade taxation authorities by generating fake GST bills? Because that's a problem that the last GST Council also deliberated and discussed, and there has been an attempt, of course, made by the government to ensure that crack down on fake GST bills.
Well, interesting point. Again, it will polarize hugely, and I don't think we'll have a decision at the end of the meeting. At least this particular meeting, I wish it comes through. But the idea is to go whole hog after those who are defaulting on any count. And when you bring such a stringent law under the GST ambit, I do believe that it will act as a deterrent. That's one of the points under discussion today. But the larger point, is gaming. I think as far as the agenda for today's meeting is concerned, gaming again would weigh heavily on the moral principle rather than the skill principle, as Sridharan pointed out. So I think it'll go to the higher kitty or the higher bucket in this case rather than the lower bucket. The big ticket reform in GST, that's what we should look at. This is just a small change, if I can use that phrase, is the tax rationalization structure, which I think is unlikely to happen even if we have the next meeting coming maybe in 3 months before elections. So there is huge demand at the macro and the micro level, Shweta, on reforming GST, both from revenues accruing to the states as also in terms of the consumer paying for GST at the tariff level. It was supposed to be Mr. Modi, when it was announced and brought through a massive consensus by the then Finance Minister Arun Jaitley, as good and simple tax. It has come through, but it's still not good and simple tax. I guess the government should realize that, not only the centre government, but the states who are equally represented in the GST Council. It's chaired by the finance minister, but it has a very strong representation of the states. So once we are beyond the political, as I call the, the political Rubicon, we must address these issues and truly make GST as a, strong pillar or symbol of India's economic reform program, which it has started off very well, but there are still challenges.
On the rationalization of tax slabs, Syed, what are your big expectations?
See, rationalization is going to take time. It's not something which we can expect to happen in one meeting. It's going to take a series of meetings to ensure that there is rationalization of the tax rates. There are certain conversations specifically from some sectors regarding multi-utility vehicles, where there is some rationalization expected on that front, as well as certain tax rates on food and beverages sold in cinemas. What should be the tax rates on those? So there are specific conversations and some requests from the sectors relating to that, but rationalization as such is going to take time to come through.
Okay, rationalization is going to take time. Last word to you, Srinath. I want to understand from you, an appellate tribunal is also what the industry has been seeking for a very long time, because taxpayers had to approach court, they had to approach various authorities to resolve dispute. There's been a sort of a delay in setting up of GST appellate tribunal. A lot of expectations there by the way of some movement as far as setting up an appellate tribunal.
I think this will come through this year. Election year, some of the good optics to say good governance, clean governance, fundamentally will boost some of these optics. So I think we should see a tribunal getting at least announced, probably not in motion until the next financial year, but at least announced and kick-started to life.
All right. Announcement, of course, expected. GST 50th meeting of the GST Council is currently underway. Gentlemen, appreciate you both taking time out and joining us on that story. Moving on, after pulling out of the semiconductor joint venture with Vedanta, Taiwanese electronics manufacturing giant Foxconn says it is working to apply separately for setting up a semiconductor manufacturing unit in India. It said that it's reviewing the landscape for the optimal partners for the project. The development follows, remember, Foxconn's announcement of exit from a semiconductor joint venture with Vedanta, a $19.5 billion joint venture, as the venture struggled to get a technology partner to make semiconductor chips in India. Many are calling it a blow to the semiconductor mission, the plans that India has. But remember, the government has come out, clarified that this is not likely to be a blow. In fact, Vedanta and Foxconn, even if they're moving in their separate directions, will continue to venture out to find a tech partner and perhaps set up a semiconductor fab. We are discussing that, of course. Big story. Anjana Menon, who's the CEO of Content Pixies and also a columnist, joining us at this point. Anjana, I want to understand from you, what are going to be the immediate ramifications of this GV breaking down?
Well, this isn't the first time that India's tried to push aggressively into semiconductors. It has happened before. We've been at it, I think, since 2013 or even way before that, trying to bring semiconductors in. Obviously, it focuses the attention on India's, desire to gain some kind of geopolitical currency because it wants to get into semiconductor manufacturing so aggressively, and it's willing to incentivize companies here. It is a pushback to that effort because it's not like you can set up a chip factory or a foundry overnight and suddenly you gain a foothold in the so-called chip manufacturing global table. So it is a setback for what is likely to be its sort of segue into having a larger place in the geopolitical sphere.
Right. And Anjana, you mentioned that it's not easy to set up a fab, and we've discussed this before here on News9. It takes years and years, approximately 4 to 8 years after you've started setting up to finally give an output that merits distribution and can go through quality checks. It is, in fact, a very long-drawn process.
Well, there are lots of issues with wafer fabs, which is why the world is kind of divided between Taiwan, which makes 90% of the chips in the world, America, which is trying to take that dominance away, and China, which has its eye on Taiwan because it's looking at chip security. It's also an extremely water-intensive industry, and I've written about this a couple of months ago when the plans were first announced. We are now the most populous country in the world, and water is an issue for us because we've only got probably 4% of the freshwater resources of the world. To just put it in perspective for the lay reader, I'm sure a lay viewer, a lot of us have ROs at home for purifying water. And so when you switch on your RO machine, a lot of the water that comes out is wasted water because it's extracted and wasted with water, and it's given you a smaller quantity of drinking water. Wafer fab needs ultra pure water, which means that the amount of water wastage is huge. Taiwan's success in part has partly or mostly really been because it gets a huge supply of water from typhoons and the monsoon. And so its reservoirs are always full, and it's managed to keep its dominance because of that. And the years that they've had a drought, they have slipped back. They have failed to supply chips to the world. So I think for India, there is a greater balance that it needs to look at, which is between securing what you could call chip security versus looking at the environment and the needs of the most populous country in the world, and water being such an essential component.
Right. Interestingly, you also mentioned in that article that you were referring to that India must reconsider whether it can afford to be a chip-making hub or is better off seeking strategic alliance that we are seeking. We have Micron, Rakesh, expressing interest in India, and we've got a huge market for chips in India. But what we need right now, as many would say, is chip-making facility. It sets us back.
Obviously, it sets us back. I think the government of India, in its true style, has articulated a proactive line of defense. But one has to cut through that and see that there is a challenge. And even with this joint venture happening, the tech partner was missing. That's where they fell apart. So, Anjana, my old colleague, has rightly articulated, water as a critical issue. And that is a challenge, I think, that will apply to new projects also if they are in areas where there is water shortage. For instance, Gujarat may not be that well endowed. She'll correct me on that if that's the right place. So there is a geographical play for all such projects. And the second is the tech partner. There's a lot of intent. Government of India has been articulating that very strongly, that we have so many levels of interest. Ashwini Vaishnav has gone on record. Rajiv Chandrasekhar has gone on record. US and India have gone into a strategic huddle on this particular, very, very strategically important area. But weaning away investors from Taiwan to India, and with China keeping an eye on both, is not going to be easy. It's easier said than done. I would agree with Anjana. But Anjana, you tell me, going forward, what kind of a recipe would you lay out for us to really reimagine the semiconductor space where we have inherent and investor interest at the policy level? We have invested a large amount of money to invest. Here is a government which is throwing so much, good money probably at a venture that hasn't taken off yet.
Well, the government hasn't really put money in on the ground yet. And I think part of the reason was what I read was that the government was questioning the blueprint and the capital layout for these firms. But what probably the government should look at is to have a secure pipeline of supply, which is a strategic securing of that supply. For example, we're not an oil surplus country, but we are importing a lot of our oil. So can you be somewhere in that pipeline? For example, can your engineers be the ones designing the chipset? So you have skin in the game, and hence you also have access to the supply. So I think my stance would be to say the goal should be to secure chip supplies more than insisting that all the chips that we put into our machines, or 90% of the chips, have to be made somewhere in a wafer fab in India. That is probably a tall ask, and I think China is already struggling with that. The US has come into play well after Taiwan. So it's a good ambition to have, but there are practical difficulties with it.
Absolutely, practical difficulties that we're dealing at the moment. A tough ask technology that is possessed by China and the raw material, technology possessed by the US and the raw material that China is now hoping that it can hold on to and put sanctions there. So of course, war on chips, as we say, is heating up. Chips that are essentially used in every part of electronics that we use today, from a mobile phone to your cars and your laptops. Everything is powered by chips. Chips, as they say, could be
suddenly
the new
chips
oil.
have become like the most important part in our lives. And from the business to business perspective, business to consumer perspective, and business to government perspective, all of them are playing at the same time. I do believe that, so long as the government of India is committed to see this as a hugely strategically important area, solutions will come back. This is an initial setback. The good news is that Foxconn remains committed to, being together with India. There are challenges with Vedanta as a partner as well. It's a great company. It has a diversified portfolio. But in the last couple of years, it hadn't the best of the run. So in that sense, getting into a new area and making a great success of it instantly is possibly a bit of a challenge that the joint venture couldn't take off.
Absolutely, and the joint venture, of course, couldn't take the challenge. They've now parted ways, Foxconn and Vedanta. It may set us back, but remember, they were both seeking technology partner. They will independently now continue to seek technology partner. As they say, chips is the new oil, and we can only see war on a global level, a soft war sort of heating up, more and more players trying to grab their hands at whatever they can as far as chip making facilities is concerned. India is also not holding back. We have, of course, rolled out a giant semiconductor mission action plan, hoping to get fab set up in India extremely very, very soon. Anjana, appreciate you taking time out and joining us on that big story. Rakesh.
Good to have you, Anjana. Thank you with us. Let's have more of you in the shows going forward.
Absolutely. We look forward to having Anjana and Rakesh. Thanks very much for joining on that very important story. We're going to move on and end this bulletin. Thanks very much for watching.